A few days ago, a friend asked me to look at his ETF portfolio, and over my 19 years of professional investment experience, both on Wall Street and here in Europe, I had never seen anything this ridiculous. My friend had 22 different ETFs, active and passive funds, large cap and small cap, many overlapping regions and strategies. This portfolio was clearly built to maximize fees for the private banker who recommended it. Nobody in Europe needs 22 different ETFs, but how many do you need for an optimal diversified portfolio? As with all important questions, the answer depends on who you are. So let me walk you through a few different case studies of my investing students and what they decided. And I will share why I personally sometimes have as many as 10 different ETFs in my portfolio. Okay, so our first case study is Jose. He's a 30-year-old software developer from Spain, now living in Berlin. He is single, financially ambitious, and starting to invest from zero. Importantly, Jose has a high ability to tolerate investment risk because he's employed by a government agency with full unemployment protections, excellent healthcare, and he's got a supportive family back home. So even if things go wrong, even if the market falls by 40% and stays down for years, even if the economy goes bad, Jose would not be forced to sell his ETF portfolio to cover his spending needs. And this means he can afford to maximize risk and put 100% of his portfolio into the stock market. He wants a simple, passive, set it and forget it approach. That is why Jose decided on a one ETF portfolio. A lot of beginning investors ask, can one ETF really be enough? I mean, isn't this putting all your eggs in one basket, which is supposed to be dangerous? Well, the thing is, a good ETF is already highly diversified. Take, for example, VWCE, the Vanguard FTSE All-World Accumulating ETF. This invests your money in almost 4,000 different stocks in developed and emerging markets. If any single company or any global region gets into trouble, you should still be fine. And the ETF structure itself is designed to be very safe. Even if the fund provider Vanguard were to go bankrupt, your money is held separately, and that means it stays safe. So a single ETF can absolutely be enough for some investors. That is why Jose chooses a single global ETF, but not BWCE. You see, BWCE is an accumulating ETF. That means when it gets dividends from stocks, it does not pay those dividends out. It keeps them inside the fund. But Jose lives in Germany. Every year he gets a 1,000 euro tax-free allowance for investment income. So for him, it's optimal to get a bit of dividends every year. And that's why he buys the distributing version of the same ETF. Next case study, we've got Mary, who is 55 and lives in Ireland. Over her 3 decades at a corporate job, Mary has saved up a sizable nest egg of 300,000 euros. She wants to invest this money and add more to it over the next 10 years until her retirement. Because Mary is a cautious person, she chooses a balanced strategy that can work both before and during retirement, the 60-40 portfolio. In short, Mary wants to have 60% of her money in global stocks and 40% in high-quality bonds, which can protect her portfolio in difficult times. So, how many ETFs does Mary need? Well, it depends. You can find ETFs which give you a pre-packaged mix of stocks and bonds, and that means you don't have to do anything yourself. For example, there's this one. But Mary wants to have more control of her portfolio, so she chooses to have one stock ETF and one bond ETF. On the stock side, she cares about socially responsible investing, so she chooses this fund from Xtrackers, which is a global stock fund that filters stocks for their social responsibility characteristics. And on the bond side, Mary wants an ETF that is going to serve as a portfolio stabilizer. The ETF needs to include investment-grade bonds, which means low credit risk, and they need to be denominated in euros so that Mary doesn't have any unnecessary currency risk. Reviewing all this, Mary chooses the iShares Core Euro Corporate Bond ETF. And this is Mary's 2 ETF portfolio. For our next case study, we've got a tricky case where the right answer to how many ETFs is actually 0. Meet Olga. She's 40 years old, the owner of a successful marketing agency, and a risk taker. Olga is willing to put 100% of her savings into the stock market. Specifically, she wants to invest in developed world stocks. However, she's concerned about the geopolitical tensions that Trump is causing between America and Europe, so she wants to invest less in America and more closer to home. In other words, she wants to put a home bias in her portfolio, where 30% is invested in Europe and the rest is spread proportionally around the world. Now, the cleanest way to do this is to use two stock funds, a developed world fund plus a European fund. In fact, based on what she learned from my training, Olga calculated that if she put 83% of her portfolio in a developed world fund and 70% in a European fund, this would give her an overall exposure of 30% to Europe, because the global fund also includes Europe as part of it. Olga could build this portfolio by putting 83% into an ETF like EUNL, the iShares Core MSCI World ETF, and 17% into EUNK, the iShares Core MSCI Europe ETF. But there's an important detail that I haven't shared. While Olga is originally from Lithuania, she now lives in Spain, where she plans to spend the rest of her life. And in Spain, there's a special rule where index mutual funds allow you to move money from fund to fund without paying capital gains tax. And that's not the case with ETFs. Like many Spanish tax residents, Olga does not want ETFs in her portfolio. Instead, she chooses index mutual funds. She goes to the fund platform My Investor and chooses these two funds instead. Next up, let's look at a student of mine who has 6 ETFs in his portfolio, and for a good reason. But before I explain why, here's something to consider. As you can see, choosing an optimal ETF or index fund can be a little bit tricky. You've got to take into account your age, your goals, and your tax situation. If you want to learn how to do this well, you might benefit from my step-by-step training program for European investors, the Index Masterclass. In the training, I take you through everything that you need to know, including the local tax rules in your European country. If that sounds interesting, follow the first link in the description and book a call with my team to discuss. Okay, but for the next case study, meet Charles. He's a former entrepreneur who sold his companies and now has around 11 million euros in investments. He's only 50 years old, but he's fully retired and pursuing his hobbies. Charles has also chosen a typical 60-40 retirement portfolio of stocks and bonds. So why does Charles hold 6 different ETFs? Well, it's because he is very conservative and protective of his wealth. Charles splits his large portfolio among 3 different brokerage houses: Interactive Brokers in Ireland, Saxo in Denmark, and Julius Baer in Switzerland. Julius Baer is a private bank and it's quite expensive, but Charles values its reputation for customer service and confidentiality. And at each of these brokerages, Charles reproduces the same 60-40 stock bond portfolio, but at every brokerage, he purchases ETFs from a different fund provider. He wants an extra layer of diversification. So on the stock side, his portfolio includes VWCE, IUSQ, and SPYY. And on the bond side, he's got this one, and this one, and this one. For most beginning investors, this kind of 6 ETF portfolio would be total overkill. But Charles's philosophy is that no matter what happens with any of the brokerages, no matter what happens with any fund provider or individual fund, he will be fine. And because he's got a good accountant and tax advisor, the added complexity in his case is totally worth it. Next up, we've got one of my most sophisticated students with a portfolio that is on the verge of being too complicated, but it still makes sense for him. So Bruno is from Argentina, but he lives in Switzerland. He is 35 years old and he works in private equity. Bruno enjoys researching different investments in ETFs and takes a very hands-on approach with his money. Now, for most of his portfolio, he wants to be maximally diversified. So he's going to put 70% into an all-world fund that tracks large, mid, and small-cap companies around the world. Most global ETFs only include large and mid-cap companies, so by adding small caps, Bruno gets some extra diversification. The next 10% of the portfolio he puts into a gold ETF. He knows that long-term, gold is expected to underperform stocks, but in the short to intermediate term, gold in small amounts can be an excellent portfolio diversifier, because gold and stocks tend to move up and down at different times. Then he puts another 10% into a REIT ETF. This is an ETF which buys real estate investment trusts. Bruno chooses it because real estate is a massive part of the global economy which is underrepresented in the stock market. And finally, with the last 10% of his portfolio, Bruno wants to play. He wants to make some market bets. Right now, he's allocating it to a clean energy ETF. He knows that these kinds of sector bets don't work out that well for most people, but he believes in his own ability to make good choices. Okay, so this is a portfolio with 4 major components. Building it would normally take 4 to 5 ETFs, depending on whether you can get all company sizes in a single ETF or whether you need 2 different funds. But there's another nuance. Because Bruno lives in Switzerland, he actually has access to US domiciled ETFs, not only European ones. So here are the funds he actually uses to build his portfolio. Okay, but what about me? How many ETFs do I have in my portfolio? Well, it depends on the moment in time. There are some days when you might look at my portfolio and I might have as many as 10. It might be a mess of overlapping funds, but that is simply because I'm doing YouTube videos and webinars and workshops for my students where I demonstrate buying and selling different funds. On a long-term basis, I have a pretty simple all-world portfolio covering large, mid, and small-cap stocks. That said, I do this across multiple brokerages in different countries to protect my family's wealth. And at every brokerage, I often buy a different version of the same ETF from a different provider. As a result, I have 5 major ETFs in my own portfolio. Now, all of the case studies I walked you through are based on my students who built their own ETF and index fund portfolios on their own. I never give investment recommendations. I don't give you the fish, I teach you how to fish so that you can make good decisions. So they completed my step-by-step training program for European investors, the Index Masterclass, and they started investing. They also benefited from the country tax briefings that we provide, which makes it much easier to choose the right funds for your local tax rules. If you too would like to start ETF investing or to improve your portfolio, I invite you to follow the first link in the description, check out our program, and book a call with my team to see if you are a good fit.